Over the summer, I visited a few buildings that were really iconic in different ways. And one of them is the Seattle Public Library, which is a building that I grew up in architecture school 20 years ago. It was really like a canonical building. Like it was like it really defined almost an era of architecture. So being able to go and visit it was a very cool experience. And so I'm going to walk you through some of the things that I saw walking through it as a builder, as an architect, as someone who develops projects, because every building requires the same things. It all requires life safety, things like sprinklers, fireproofing, structure. How does the thing stand up? They all require all the same things like air conditioning, whatever it is. But the thing is, in some buildings, it's a lot harder to see, or it's a little more tricky how they actually went about putting it together. And so I'm going to point out some of the things I saw in this building. Looking at other buildings and breaking down the tactics and techniques of how they did different things is a great way to understand and sort of learn from them so that we can apply these lessons to all sorts of different projects. All right, so here we are at the Seattle Public Library. This is just an image that I think I took looking up at it from the street. And you can see a bunch of stuff we're going to talk about here, but the sort of faceted structure of it is really what is so iconic about it. And it's one of those things that even kids love to draw it. This is one of my daughter's drawings. This sort of faceted structure, they've got all sorts of reasons or sort of pseudo reasons because they're not required to work this way, but they've kind of rationalized this type of geometry, which is a whole architecture conversation in and of itself. But I'm more interested in the result of the thing. And when you see it, like, what's the experience for the user? And that's what is transferable to all of these projects that we're going to be talking about. Like, that's why I look at this and it applies to you, because it matters how they handle things here, because there's lessons that we can learn. So when you look at the building at night, it starts to show itself a little bit more because you can start to see that there's all this cross bracing up higher in the building. You start to see that there's all this bracing that is really holding up this sort of larger box. And in a second, I'll show you why they think of these as sort of these boxes that are floating and how this works. But effectively, it's these boxes, and you start to see different things showing up. You can see the cross bracing. You start to see potentially different ways that the skin is handled. So some of these are vents. Some of these are different sort of operable things that are really doing different jobs that any building has to do. When you look at it from the street, this is looking from the sort of uphill side. One of the things that's sort of neat about this building is the way it's in Seattle and the way the street falls away from it. It's actually a fairly steep street. And the other thing is the way that the building actually does sort of allow people to come in and through the structure. So the glass is actually back here, but you're allowed to sort of go through the lattice part of it here for the main entrance. This is a closer view of what that looks like. And you start to be able to see that where the door vestibule sort of goes through the sloping wall, you start to see how the irregular geometry has to get sort of like rectified with certain things that need to be more square, like a door, for instance. You also start to see how the corners, you can imagine how all these different corners have so many different things. And even this little piece right here, this sort of gutter, just very practically speaking, to keep people from getting soaked as they are walking under the building. And we'll see a couple details of that. So I mentioned before that there's this sort of rationale where the architects, OMA, they had this idea where they were making these blocks. So these blocks that are more solid, and over here they're representing them as these sort of blocks here. The spiral for the books itself, the headquarters office. These are all the things that they sort of identified as things that needed walls effectively, or more controlled environments, versus these other areas where, in their sort of typical fashion, especially in the 90s / early 2000s, they were looking at things that way with, these ideas. And when they started making, as the building develops, you can start to see the way that they're talking about these different things. And this is very, a highly graphic language. But what you start to see is these sort of larger zones that are shaped by the sloping roof parts, whether it's sort of undercutting and connecting these blocks or these more roof kind of ones. And that's really the idea of the project, is like is creating these different zones that are between. So you've got these blocks, the solid spaces, and then you've got these mixing zones, reading rooms, living room, as they call it, down below, or sort of in between these blocks. And that really is the experience as you move through the facility. And being able to simplify it into such a simple diagram, and when you combine it, it also sort of makes sense where, this is such a simplified version of the building, but it has to be clear at this sketch level, because the more clear this is, the more you can hold on to it as you go through years of developing a project, as you go through years of figuring out how to put all the details together, because there's going to be a lot of questions that need to be answered. And so in the very early models, you start to see different things showing up. So you start to see the solid blocks. You can see the sort of clear skin, which, we know can't be totally clear. This thing sort of floating. It's very unclear how that's actually standing up. As they start putting the different models into a little bit more detail, they start seeing, like even in the sketch models, one without skin, one that's got different bracing or latticing around the outside. And as you start to get into, working out the building itself, we've got the sort of stacked diagram. We've got these different elevations. As they start to work out the building a bit more, you can see that you've got these stacked diagrams that are still the same as the initial ones we saw, and the way that it's sort of translating into the elevations of the building, and the floor plans being these more solid blocks. And structurally, these are very blurry. It doesn't really matter. The point is that the building is doing a lot of work structurally, and we'll be talking about that in a minute. But the final result, this is a cross section through the building, you can really see what's going on. You start to really understand the way that this is being created, like this big outdoor area that's covered, this sort of bigger theater that's connecting the two main levels. So the main entry and then the lower level entry, these sort of upper rooms. And so even in the drawings, you can see the density of the stacks, or the sort of compressed nature of some of these mid-levels relative to the open area that you have when you're looking at these sort of reading rooms and living rooms. And that's really the idea of the building. And so when you're walking around the building, you can really feel that. And so these are pictures from the visit. And, the bike entry or the bike parking is underneath that main big sort of cantilevering section, or the main living room, as they call it, with the huge lattice roof, natural daylighting, the stores there, the cafe, all these different things. And the experience is phenomenal. It's the result of, this sort of glass roof. It really does what they were going for. And, the section of the section diagram, it's 11 levels. You can't really go up to the staff one too much, but you can really see it's all about moving through the building. So, you are here. So the main level is actually like the upper street entrance as the main entrance. And so you're actually up here. And really the whole thing is about moving up through the building. And there's all sorts of ways to do that. So our visit, we're walking through, and you've got these escalators that are taking you up. And there's all these different sort of experiences that you have as you're moving through the building itself, looking up and down these things and sort of discovering the building as you're moving through it. And these are all ideas that we can apply to any project. That's not an idea that's unique to this building. It's just that it is truly like the core of this project. In some cases it's with stairs, in some cases it's with other things. And, you can see even here, one of the things that I'll point out is the way that sprinklering is used. So these little doohickeys, this is all about, buildings have to be separated for fire reasons. And there's all sorts of technical parts about that we're not going to get into. But the point is that there are ways to use sprinklers in this way, spraying glass, to create ratings that allow you to have glass where you want it, meaning here, without having to have it be a solid drywall wall. And so this building is sort of packed with little things like that, as well as some structural gymnastics that we'll talk about in a second. So looking up from the main reading room, the building, again, it's really a very vertical building. You've got this exposed concrete core. You have this big atrium. And as you move around through it, you can really start to see all the way up. You start to see, and the building is sort of giving hints at, this is one box and it's got a certain texture. This is one box and it's got a very sort of Le Corbusian kind of strip window, which is actually like a very sort of modernist type of window from the 50s. And Rem Koolhaas, the architect who started OMA, one of them, he has all these sort of almost inside jokes, if you will, referencing architecture of the past. And buildings are always doing that because we're not really inventing anything here. But one thing I will point out is, you've got this skylight up here. Remember, this is the 11th floor up here. You've got this sort of quilted ceiling. You've got the dark ceiling. You've got a different type of ceiling down here. So even in this one picture, you can just see that there's a lot going on in the building itself. And so here we are looking back down actually towards where that last picture was taken. And if you remember the cross bracing that we saw at the very beginning, it shows up again here. And one thing that I'm going to point out, because we're going to get to this in a minute, is look how thick the bracing is. So you can see this is boxed out. It's boxed out for fireproofing reasons. And the steel on the windows or the skin is not. And we'll talk about that in just a second. Why does that matter? Because imagine if you had to box out every piece of steel that was in this thing. Not only would it be ridiculous to do, because so much of it, but it also would effectively make the windows like have zero visibility out of them. And so it's actually a critical aspect to the way that the building is experienced by the people inside. So again, we've got cross bracing and columns. You can see a little bit more of it on this level. And so just to go back to the diagram, we've got these boxes that are sort of shifted off from each other, and then the skin that's connecting them. So looking at the plan, this is the plan of the main floor, the upper street floor, the main entry. And you can see up here the gates, or the entrance, I should say, going out through the skin. And that was where we saw the tilted skin with the doors going through it. So there's a few different things going on here. There's the concrete elevator block that we talked about here. There's also this other stair core here. And, stairs need to be separated a certain distance. They need to have a certain fire rating, and concrete can usually help with that. You can also see that there's certain columns that are boxed in here. So this grid of columns that is basically supporting the dotted pink box, which is the level above it, that's offset, you can see. So, the rest of the building plan, there's nothing above it. Above it is just that sloping ceiling. So even in the plan is really giving you the feel. It's telling you why the building feels the way that it does. But how do they get away with this? How can you create this type of a structure when you've got two different things you have to deal with? And that's actually the key here, is that there's one type of structural issue, which is just how does the building stand up? Dealing with gravity, dealing with the loading of the building, dealing with the self-weight of the building, all that kind of stuff. But then the other aspect of it is lateral, meaning things like wind, or basically the twisting of a building. So like, how does it want to twist back and forth? And in order to get this project built the way that it is, they actually separated the vertical loading from the lateral loading. And you're allowed to do that in the building code. And so that's why in different projects, you'll see different elements of a building that have different fire ratings. So the skin is a much lower fire rating than the columns that we saw, or the central core, which is really responsible for much more work. And so part of that is when you go over, say, looking at the left side or any of these on the perimeter, you can see these angled lines here. There's more, you can see them over here. I'll show you what that looks like in a second, but those show up. Those are not part of the skin of the building. Those are part of the vertical loading structure for the building. Looking at a couple of exploded views, you can start to see how the structure of the building is really these boxes that are being propped up. And, these are some of those angling columns that are going out to hold up the building above. And this is what that looks like in real life. You've got this huge column that is rated, meaning it has a whole assembly of, you've got a column, and we'll look at some details in a minute, but it's got a whole box of drywall or whatever is necessary to achieve the right fire rating. Whereas this structure is effectively, in this case, this curtain wall actually is really only holding itself up. But the cross bracing, the diagrid, that's what is required for not only holding the windows, but the only real structural work it's doing is this lateral twisting. And that's why it's separated from this type of structure, meaning the column and the vertical structure, but doing its own work and allowing it to have the visibility through it. Because if you had, look how thick this is. If you had to do this to the glass, the whole project falls apart. And when we look at the diagram that they give you when you enter, again, there, it's really about moving up through the building and having this adventure. They even have these sort of scavenger hunts and things to discover along the way. And it's really, it's a fun building. And I know that's not like a technical critique of the building, but I don't know why we don't care. It's fun. People love it. It was packed. And so this is a close-up view of the structure and of the glass, I should say. You can see the quilted ceiling above from the upper level. I think this is at the very top. So like level 10, right below the top offices. And, you can see how there's a lot of exposed steel. Other places where you can get away with this, meaning this type of steel connection not needing to have, you can do this in a visible way with what we call intumescent paint, meaning it's basically paint that when it gets too hot, it sort of puffs up. It's like a gypsum. It's like drywall, and it's very expensive though. So this is not intumescent paint. This is not fire rated to the same degree that the vertical structure is. And other places we can get away with this are, say, the outside of a building, like an awning. If an awning falls down, the building doesn't fall down. If the glass falls off of this building, the building doesn't fall down. And so that's one simple way to sort of understand or rationalize why this works. But again, when you look at the building itself, the edge of this box above it's not necessarily being held up totally by this column, but it certainly is doing a lot of work. And the reason it can work sort of in that way is because, the column has both a horizontal and a vertical axis that it can be working on. And so it's angled, so it's less efficient than being pressed on directly down. But, if you built this out of a model of this, you would, a sort of leg like that would still help. And so that's what's going on here. And they're really just letting these columns kind of happen, which, makes sense. And in other cases, you can start to see that they actually, do a bit of a hybrid. So this spray-on stuff, this is just spray-on fireproofing, and it's ugly, and they painted it, which is great. But at the user level, they actually did box it out with drywall. And so this sort of a hybrid approach is actually really smart because, if you're okay seeing this stuff, which in a building like this, you have to think about, do I care about seeing this stuff, or do we want to build the building? Because if you start being sort of too uncompromising, it'll be very hard for you to get sort of as far as you want. So by balancing, hey, we're okay seeing it above basically where people are looking directly. Down low, we're going to put drywall. This is a cane rail so that people don't bonk their heads down low. And so this is a sort of hybrid of two different ways to fireproof the main vertical structure. And when you look at the detail of the glass, the way the glass is actually connecting to the steel that is for the curtain wall, the diagrid, the corners, you can imagine how complicated it is because there's just a lot of different corner conditions. I mentioned gutters even needing to be there, the way that sort of internal guttering. And when you look here, you can actually see the way that these gutters collect water and actually bring it into some drain inside. But you've got the floor structure here. In this case, I'll show this again in a minute. They actually have a floating floor, meaning this is the space rather than the ceiling. This is the space where stuff can get run and moved around. Other places, it's more of a drop ceiling where things can go down. In either case, though, this is, the smart thing is that you've got mechanical stuff that's sort of sharing a plenum or sharing like a space in the cross section where it's then distributing different elements. And, so this is cross bracing that you're being cut through in this wall section. And you can see how it's boxed out because this is actually the structure of the building. And this sort of like fuzzy line around this piece of steel, that's the spray on fireproofing. And in the taller cross section, you can see more of the same, where you've got, the main structure, the cross bracing that is showing up as fireproofed. You've got the decking, you've got the drains, you've got, more drains coming down. So all the stuff that buildings need to have in them is still present here. On the lower level, some of what we're talking about is visible as well. And what I mean by that is, this is not a fake concrete slab. That would be a huge waste of money. So what did they do? They put junction boxes of some sort in the ceiling and hung this sort of grid of lights. And then the floor is much softer. The floor is, a wood or a composite, and it's got the vents. And so in this case, they're using the floor as a way to distribute all of the mechanical stuff. And then they're letting the ceiling be just what it is. And then these horizontal lines are basically the breaks between pouring concrete. And here's just a closer view of the floor and another view of the ceiling. And this is something that comes up a lot on projects. So you've got a couple different pipes here. This is probably a sprinkler pipe. You've got that's been painted. You've got conduit that has not been painted. You've got, lights. So that might have even come in later. And you've got lights sort of gridded out. And the question really is how comfortable are you with it? If you're wondering what this box is, this is a pad. So they've thickened the slab here so that the column literally doesn't punch through the floor above. You can imagine how basically giving it a wider surface area that is thicker here locally, rather than making a thicker slab everywhere, they're thickening it above the column, which allows it to less likely to puncture through the floor above. And then they've got a big old beam here going across from there. But the question really becomes, how much of this are you okay seeing? Because it's just frankly cheaper to not have to cover it all up. And, so the question is like, how much of this are you looking at in the ceiling? Are you really looking up there? You see the lighting grid. If I didn't point out all this stuff, like, would you really see it? Like, you probably would have seen some of it. I mean, some of it's pretty dingy, frankly. And, in America, like, our concrete work isn't usually amazing like it is in some other parts of the world. So, it's a little bit raw. But again, if you're okay with that, the effect of it is pretty remarkable. And it's certainly a way to get a lot out of your dollar. So again, this is where I mentioned the door. The sloping wall here, the diagrid actually goes down on the outside. The curtain wall comes in. And so this curtain wall isn't even part of the lateral structure anymore. It's really just creating this vestibule that's square, and it goes through that sloping wall. This is another way that a ceiling is treated, and you can see how it's got like a fuzziness to it. And so just like in the children's area that we were looking at below, you can see all the pipes. So sprinkler pipes, their sprinkler head pointed up. This is all the fireproofing, the fuzziness. And then there's this screen that's been put over the whole thing, and even the lights are behind it. And so the screening has been put in to really sort of mask what's going on behind it. And, again, the more you're looking at it at an angle, the less you see through it compared to when you look straight up at it. And another way that they did that is just painting the ceiling black. So, the ceiling that we were just looking at is this part, basically this level. And then above, you can see same thing. This is all spray on fireproofing. It's pretty raw, just lights being hung that aren't overly expensive. No problem. A bunch of pipes kind of going all over the place, drains maybe from the bathroom above or whatever it is. This is where you can see the columns that are half drywalled. Down below, you can see that they actually did drywall them all, so that this has like a much more finished feel than up here. And then where it gets more raw as it goes up, and then it's all painted black as a sort of good trick. And we do this all the time as a way to kind of mask things. The book spiral itself is a true spiral, and it's got these shortcuts that are going through it that have glass walls. And again, I mentioned before sprinklering, they have sprinklers here that are washing the wall. They are dousing the wall from a very close distance to help achieve the fire rating that you need with a glass wall. And you can see more of them here. And again, a different type of ceiling, a sort of translucent ceiling above right here. So these are sort of probably some fairly cheap polycarbonate panel, which, you know, OMA is fairly famous for using. You can see these sprinkler heads, which are probably about 8 feet apart because that's typically the spread they need. And these things are wall washing the glass below so that you can maintain visual transparency with glass while not having to use fiberglass, not having to use something that's an incredibly expensive glass. You can use a cheaper glass and sprinkler it in a different way to achieve a fire rating. And this is a trick that it's not a trick, it's allowable, and it makes sense because it works. There's nothing about tricking anybody here. It's about understanding how to separate things, whether it's the structural loading or the way that we handle fireproofing. Because in order to create this type of an effect, that's what we need to do. And so, for instance, just to point out a couple things, this column in the upper left, you know, you can see how that's all boxed out and fireproof. So we can assume that that is part of the building structure. Same thing with the concrete core. Same thing with all these columns that are fireproofed. This big old beam here is not, which means it either is painted with intumescent paint, which it probably isn't. It's probably just, all it's doing is supporting this big old expanse of diagrid because it wants to sag, just like I drew that happy face. It wants to sag. So adding a beam is a good way to help it not sag, and rather than having to beef up the grid itself. And a couple other things just in this, you know, they've got sort of local lighting down lower. It's a big space, but there is lighting down low, which is nice. And again, you know, these are different ceiling conditions we've looked at. The black really does a good job to mask. You know, if you look for a minute, you can start to see all the stuff going on up there, but you know, you don't see a lot of it. And even the sort of screening that's used both in the ceiling as well as on the wall there. And the effect is pretty remarkable. It's a pretty amazing building to be in. It really is. And you know, it's an experience. You're really exploring this building, you know, the texture, the shininess of these floors even. So this is what this building is really about. It's about the experience of moving up and through it and around it in these big glassy open spaces that are only possible because of the way that the building was executed, because of the way that the techniques were used by, you know, separating the structure into different parts, by really looking at the materials, what you can see, what you can't see, what do we need to cover, what are we okay just painting and leaving alone. These are all techniques that we use in buildings way smaller, way cheaper, way less sort of grand than this one. You know, painting a ceiling black. I mean, people do it in their basements. Like it's these things are not unique to that project. They're just different ways of sort of observing what we see when we visit buildings and trying to understand it so that we can apply it to our own projects. So if that's interesting to you, please like and subscribe. I really appreciate it. And if you want to reach out to me, my contact's in the description if you want to talk about projects, because developing projects with you is what I do. And I'll see you in the next video. Thank you.